Hey everyone. I was inspired to make this video from a Reddit post I saw by Carnifex, who did a pretty good job at explaining quite technically how Subtick movement works. However, there were some claims made that I don't agree with, and also a lot of people weren't able to understand easily what was being said, so my aim here is to try and present the information in a much more intuitive and easy to understand way, and to use that to explain what problems some Subtick fixes, what problems it causes, leading to the trade-off that Subtick makes, and overall the limitations of tick rate in general. Just an aside, I want to quickly clarify that we'll be talking about subtick movement, not subtick shooting. From what I understand, subtick shooting basically uses a completely different system and actually works extremely well. So what you're seeing right now is a graph just describing some movement in game, where you have velocity on the y-axis in arbitrary units and time on the x-axis measured in ticks. So here you're speeding up and here you're slowing down again. For example, if you press W and then let go of it a few ticks later. These two values at the bottom left here, T0 and T, just describe when the movement starts and how long the movement lasts for. So here you can see the movement starts at 3 ticks in and lasts for 15 ticks. And I can change these just to change when it starts and how long it lasts for. In reality, the movements would look more like something like this for holding W, but the actual shape of the graph doesn't really matter for demonstrating how subtick works. So back to this red graph, this is an idealized version of movement, so this is what it would look like if the server ran at infinite ticks per second, or, just real life. Unfortunately for everyone though, infinite ticks per second isn't exactly very feasible, so in CSGO at 64 ticks per second, this is what movement actually looks like. Since player velocity is only changed once every tick, this causes a stepping effect you can see, where velocity only changes every tick, and the velocity between each tick is constant. You can also see that, when I change the time the movement is started, it isn't a smooth movement, it has to start on one tick or the next. It can't start between ticks, because time between ticks essentially just doesn't exist. Looking over to the left side then, the second number down is just the total distance travelled during the movement. Because if you remember from your maths or physics class, this is just the integral of velocity with respect to time, which means that the distance travelled is just equal to the shaded area under the graph. As you can quite obviously see just by looking at it, this area never changes as I move the starting time, it just jumps left and right one tick at a time. This is why for non-subtick movement, like in CSGO, the same input will always have the same outcome, regardless of when within a tick the movement key is pressed. However, it has a downside that, if you change when within a tick you make an input, the output isn't changed whatsoever. So you essentially have a random input lag being about between 0 and 16 milliseconds in 64 tick, and this is a problem that Subtick aims to solve. Now this is the graph for Subtick movement. You might be surprised to see it also has the same stepping that regular movement does, since Subtick is supposed to be able to calculate your inputs between ticks. It is able to do this, however you have to remember that subtick movement is still just based on the server tick rate, which in Counter-Strike 2 is 64 ticks per second, and velocity within those ticks still has to remain constant, just like in CSGO, since time between those ticks still doesn't really exist. However, watch what now happens when I change the start time for the subtick input. As you can see, while velocity is still changed in every tick, the velocity does respond and change based on the precise moment you made an input, in order to more closely line up with what the movement ideally should be. Remember, that's the graph in red. Also, you can see that if you manage to make an input exactly on the tick, the subtick movement ends up being identical to the non-subtick movement. This is the reason that de-subticked keybinds allow you to perfectly replicate CSGO's movement, since it essentially locks your movements to happen exactly on a tick. While you still need to wait until the next tick to start moving, from that point onwards, your movements will be impacted by the exact time you made an input. So if you press it even just a fraction of a tick sooner, you'll move a tiny bit faster, whereas in CSGO, both inputs would have resulted in the exact same motion. This is how Subtick solves the random input lag issue. So if this is what Subtick is doing, then surely it's just objectively better, right? Well, you may have noticed on the left that I also have an integral describing the total distance travelled for the subtick movement, and that unlike the non-subtick movement, the distance you travel does change depending on when within the tick the input is made. You can see this intuitively by just looking at the graph as it moves. Once again, the heights of different parts of the graph are constantly changing, meaning that the area under them is constantly changing as well, meaning the total distance travelled changes. This is the reason that subtick movements can be inconsistent for the exact same input, depending on when within the tick the input was made. Another cause for inconsistency is the fact that your velocity is now different at different parts of the movement, depending on when the input was made. One practical example of this is the now famous Mirage arch jump, where hitting your head off of the arch propels you forwards an inconsistent distance. This is because your velocity when hitting the arch is slightly different each time you do it, so you bounce off of it with a slightly different velocity each time. Or, if instead of the y-axis being velocity, we treat the y-axis as height, so now this graph represents height during a jump, you can see that the maximum height you reach now changes slightly depending on when you jump. Once again, the actual graph would actually look more like this, being a parabola, but the same principle still applies, the shape of the graph doesn't matter. And this is the reason that maximum jump height is inconsistent compared to CSGO. For long inputs, say over the course of 1 second, or 64 ticks as I have here, you can see that the variation in both distance travels and peak height, if you treat it as height, is extremely small. For the function I've chosen, the distance travelled doesn't vary by more than about 0.05%, depending on when you made the input. However, the problem becomes larger the smaller the input is. For a movement that lasts, say, 5 ticks, for example a quick tap of the W key, the variation with this function is now more than 6%. This is ultimately the trade-off that comes with subtick movements. You can choose to have a non-subtick system like CSGO with consistent movements but random input lag, or you can have a subtick system that remedies the input lag problem but now causes slightly inconsistent movement. In a tick-based system, unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, there's no good way to straight up solve both of these issues at once, and undoubtedly if there was, then Valve would have probably opted for it instead. However, there is one thing that can significantly reduce both of these problems at once, no matter which system you're using, and that is increasing the tick rate. For example, by doubling the tick rate, then for non-subtick movements, you pretty much halve the amount of input lag on average, and for subtick movement, you significantly reduce the variation in distance travelled, since the movement is spread out over more ticks. So basically, the moral of the story is, Valve, just give us 128 tick servers, please. Thanks for watching.